virtual paddock.
Hey everyone, it's Lars here, and welcome back to Virtual Paddock. So this past weekend it was the RCI 24h of Kyalami in ACC. For me it was my first 24-hour race in ACC and my second 24 overall. We competed in Split 2, which was for low silver and amateurs. We did low silver, driving the number 285 Aston Martin with 4 drivers. It was Nico, Stian, then Brian joining us from America, and of course myself. So we qualified P17 and Nico then started the race. Generally we went with double stinting for this one, so he did the first 2 hours, started in the rain, and this time we actually were prepared. We had practiced quite a lot. And the setup was absolutely fantastic in the wet. Nico made up several positions, up to P9. Pace was around 149, and by the end of the second hour it actually stopped raining. So when I then took over, we put on slicks. But first that was a huge challenge. There was a dry line, but generally it was still quite damp and the line was quite narrow at first. And it took me several laps to really get the tires working. And adding to that, the race had started at 6 PM in game. So it was also getting quite dark by that time. My first few laps were around 147, but within like 15 to 20 minutes I was down to 44s and occasionally 43s. And generally I kept it consistent for 2 hours. I had pretty good pace, but then unfortunately about maybe 15 minutes before the next scheduled driver swap, I very suddenly in the S's had a wheel disconnect. And figuring that whole thing out and reconnecting my wheel, I was stranded at the side of the track for at least 3 minutes, and I lost like 10 positions. And then while Brian was getting ready, I still had to do 2 more laps, without force feedback, and that's pretty much impossible to do. I lost several seconds just because I had no confidence, I didn't know what the car was doing. And then Brian had some problems with the pit stop, which cost us an additional 2 minutes. So when he finally left the pits, we were all the way down to P29. So obviously I was quite frustrated, but then the guys reminded me that it was still a long way to go. And we definitely had some good pace. Brian had already gotten back up to P21 by the time he took his scheduled mid-stint stop. But just about 15 minutes later he actually had to pit again, because it had started to rain again. But by doing that he could extend his stint a little more, since he had to pit at least every 70 minutes. And obviously every time in the pits reset that timer. But even in the wet we still had great pace, very similar to Nico's stint at the start, doing around 149s. Gained a few more positions up to P17. And then Stian took over next, and he basically continued that trend. In his first stint it was raining pretty heavily, but he stayed consistent. And in the second half the rain got a lot lighter, to the point that when it was time for the next driver swap, Stian really kind of dragged it out as long as possible. Then Brian went out on slicks, and by that point we were in P15. It was still raining slightly, though the track was just considered damp at this point. Brian at first did lap times at around 150, was kind of similar to my first stint, though a bit more extreme. But eventually it did dry up and the times came down pretty quickly. Got up to around 143 when he had to pit, but then we were P12. He kept it up after the stop and drove into the sunrise, up to P10, and then Nico took over. And if there's one thing that you guys need to know about Nico, it's that the C in his name stands for consistency. Though obviously being in the upper positions now, it was a bit more difficult to gain positions. I think he was in P9 after his 2 hour stint then, and at the very end of it, I think it was on the last lap of that stint, it once again started raining. So then when I took over, we put on wets again. So now I was facing exactly the opposite challenge to my first stint, because now I had wets that were getting quite hot at first, but luckily still controllable, and with the track getting wetter it cooled them down a bit. Pressures generally were a bit on the high side though, so I lowered them a little for my stop. Worked out pretty well, and generally we were among the fastest in the wets, sometimes even like 2 seconds a lap faster than some of the cars around us. So within my 2 hours I gained 2 more positions, up to P7. Luckily in this stint my wheel did the full distance, and afterwards, to be very honest, I was exhausted, and a lot more than after my stint the previous night. Then following my stint, Nico did a single stint and then Stian did triple. Unfortunately there was one team that was quite a bit quicker than Stian was at that point, so we fell back 1 position to P8. But to be honest, we are already pretty happy with the comeback that we'd made after the first few hours. We had some really good pace both in dry and in the wet. And speaking of the weather, it actually stopped raining again midway through Stian's stint. So he did his second stop a bit earlier and did the final part in slicks. Then he switched to me, I did a single stint, entirely dry this time, and I then switched to Brian for the final 2.5 hours. And Brian at first had plans to maybe try and get back to P7, who at this point were almost a lap ahead. But unfortunately there was one driver a few laps behind who just kept driving like he was racing us, and every time Brian got past him, he'd get dive bombed a few corners later. But eventually that other guy did make a mistake and we finally got away from him. Now, because of the maximum stint time of 70 minutes, at that point the plan was for Brian to take new tyres after his first hour, and then just pit for a little bit of fuel about 10-15 minutes before the end, without taking new tyres. But then, with around an hour left to go, the weather forecast actually showed rain coming for the final 30 minutes. So obviously he then switched to wets again for the last half hour. Another thing that I'd actually brought up quite a few times throughout the race was the brakes. We're using brake pads 3, which last the longest, and they had definitely held up well so far. And it wasn't until around the last 20 minutes that there started to be some noticeable brake fade. But not too bad, and just on the rears. Brian managed to drive around it, braking a bit earlier for the bigger braking zones with less pressure, and essentially they did the full 24. So when we crossed the line at the end, we finished in P8, and luckily for us, the car ahead actually had a 130-second time penalty. So officially in the race results, we were P7. And that was an absolutely fantastic result, especially considering the problems resulting from my wheel disconnect. We gained back more than 20 places, we were fast and consistent all around, and after the already great result at Zolder last month, this is even more of a confidence boost. And we know we're likely doing something right if we're getting these kinds of results. I will admit that the weather definitely helped us in a way, but somehow it also helped everyone. Because for dry tires there was a limit of, I think, 17 sets. So in a completely dry race, that would have meant lots of double stinting, but we actually didn't have to double stint any of the tire sets. And I think we even had a dry set left at the end. Alright, so that's my report for the RCI 24 hours of Kyalami. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video. So, till next time, use the downforce, and see you soon.